Hey, House community, you're watching House Arrest. We've reached the end of October where the slew of Jewish holidays is behind us, and we're looking at a pretty typical, uninteresting November ahead with only the faint glimmer of Hanukkah's lights in mid-December keeping us connected to our Yiddishkeit. But for us Jews, our celebrations have quieted down, but this weekend comes a holiday that is a hallmark of the fall, that being Halloween. Always the holiday that we Jews simply don't take part in. No trick-or-treating for us, no dressing up. But tonight, I want to dig a little bit deeper and see if there's anything Jewish about Halloween. We'll be probing into Jewish history to uncover any kippah-clad witches or wizards and see what's going on down there. So to do that, I've invited two guests. First guest I'd like to introduce is Joshua Schwartz. Hey, Josh, how are you?
Hey, Dina, I'm doing all right. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So Josh is the spiritual leader of Beth Lida Forest Hill Synagogue in Toronto. He's the co-author of The Torah of Music, which won the Jewish Book Award, the editor of the illustrated Pirkei Avot, the world's first Talmudic graphic novel, and the co-creator of Seder Oneg Shabbos. Josh is currently completing rabbinic ordination with a yeshiva in Jerusalem, has a graduate degree in Jewish mysticism from NYU, and is a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Definitely the man for the job tonight. We'll find out.
We'll see.
I'd also like to introduce Cassia Finkelstein. Hey, Cassia, welcome to the stream.
Hello. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
So Cassia, you're a Master of Arts candidate in Humanities at York University. Cassia studied the influence anti-Semitism has in folklore and has had on the literature of the fantastic. Cassia has previously presented on this topic at an educational conference with regards to various forms of coding ascribed to Rowling Severus Snape in order to assist with othering him as a potentially evil wizard for the first 6 novels of her series. So if you didn't understand half of those words, that's okay. We'll explain all of it. I'm really excited to sort of delve into that if we have time. But by day, Cassia works as an assistant marketing manager at Colliers International. So welcome to the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll just start by getting a sense of, the temperature in the room. When you think of Halloween, what comes to mind? Either of you can jump in. Besides the pumpkins and stuff.
Like candy sales?
Yeah, candy sales.
The day after?
The day after, yeah, that's true.
Oh, yeah. Let's make sure we get all the sales. Let's not play into any anti-Semitism.
I like stocking up on candy and expensive. Okay.
I went trick-or-treating as a kid. I'm gonna out myself. I grew up, I'm from down south. I'm from America, from America.
Oh, me too.
Hey, what up? USA.
No, not the same.
And I went trick-or-treating. I was like a normal American. Well, I was like an average American boy. Not sure about normal, but I don't know. Like I feel like my community was like very Americanized, but I think Halloween was exactly one of those things. Halloween. And interestingly, in like the rabbinic literature, one of the big like flash points in terms of like test cases for Americanizing is Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, which is in a way like the most Jewish Goyish holiday. It's like, okay, yeah, you sit around a table with your family. There's a lot of food.
Eat a lot. Yeah.
Basically cookies. Yeah, exactly. So, but like Thanksgiving, like, can you participate in like the majority Gentile culture, what's called Darkei Amori in the halachic literature? But I think Halloween is like, Adina, like your proposal of this topic is brilliant, I think, because like Halloween is not just like a neutral majority culture holiday. It has its roots in paganism.
Yeah.
It has roots in, I would really say, a Christian inflected paganism, right? Like the way paganism interacts with a Christian dominant society. I want to like can I ask like some big questions that maybe will frame our conversation?
Sure.
Hit it.
Okay. The questions I definitely did not pre-write, and I'm definitely not reading off of a note right now, is what is it like to relate to a holiday of fear when we as Jews have experienced being the object of fear?
Yeah.
And not just an object of fear, but identical with the forces of evil or Satan, right? That our very appearance coincides with, that we're seeing, like, it's not an accident that like the devil or demons or whatever all kind of look Jewy. They got the nose, they got the steeply fingers, right? You know, it didn't take too much for all the terrible images we see on like 4chan or whatever, like to get to the Jew. And I think one question I have is like moving forward, because I never wanted to stay trapped in the past. My question moving forward, can we as Jews recover the pleasure that we can have in like an aesthetics of horror? Can we actually reclaim and reimagine what actually a Jewish horror grammar, a Jewish horror lexicon or something like that could look like?
That's so interesting. I don't know the answers, but I'm hoping that we can work on them together tonight.
Now we'll figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Thesis ready.
Really good. I think we can. I mean, I don't know if you guys are versed in the Jewish witches community, but that's kind of an example. There's a bunch of Jews who are practicing witches in various ways, like through Jewish mysticism and other avenues. Like, I'm not one, but I follow one, and she writes like a blog that's actually very handy. She just recently wrote an article that was about like the difference between Judaism and Christianity. And I think it's just jewwitches.com or something. I don't remember exactly what the URL is for her. But I think that that act of doing that is kind of already an act of reclaiming that sort of othering that we've been subjected to, in terms of like a lot of conceptions of witches come from anti-Semitism. Yeah. And kind of being like a proud Jewish witch is a way of moving forward from that. And then that can also work with maybe celebrating Halloween. Because like, I also grew up trick-or-treating, and it's fun. You're in like a community with people, you go door to door and you like get candy, and it's a bit like what my aunt tells me is what happens after Passover in Montreal, where in like the Moroccan Jewish community, apparently they like open their doors and they have like all this dessert and everything and all this stuff you can't eat during Passover because, you know, but we have to celebrate. So it's a bit like that.
Before we get any further, Cassia, you've actually led me exactly where I want to go. I want to delve into this conversation, but I'd like to start with a little bit of a game. It's not really a challenge for either of you, but it'll just sort of put us in the mood with some nice visuals. So I know that Judaism has its own history of witches and demons and clairvoyance, but before we get to all of that, I've compiled a number of pictures of some famous creatures in pop culture, and your job tonight is to be the first to identify them or their source, and if you know of any sort of speculative connection to Judaism these characters may hold. So this is no way meant to like defame any authors or writers or film producers or anything like that, but let's just see what comes out, okay? Here we go. Sure. Let me just share my screen. All right. The first image is this.
The Hobbit dwarves. Do you want like all their names? What are you looking for?
No, Hobbit dwarves. Yeah, I guess the word The Hobbit is there, so that makes it kind of easy. But maybe not everyone knows that there are dwarves in The Hobbit.
It's only the dwarves. I don't see Bilbo.
Oh yeah, that's true. So tell us, like, dwarves. Okay, we were talking about this a little bit in the past before we went live. The image of a dwarf, right? Short, stout. Not necessarily super attractive.
Like
what is that? What's
Big
that?
Nose, sunken eyes, all of that. Yeah, there's a lot of links between dwarves and anti-Semitism in various forms of folklore. You end up with the first that comes to mind is the way that Tommyknockers went from being Jewish ghosts in the mines into becoming Tommyknockers into becoming dwarves in Cornish lore. So there's a direct link, and that also is part of what inspired Tolkien's writings. Like Tolkien's writings in The Hobbit are very much inspired by anti-Semitism, and he kind of realized that, and he wrote them a little bit more humanely in Lord of the Rings as a result.
Yeah, fantasy is this like fascinatingly pungent genre in the sense that like it is a genre that's deeply invested in race science, right? There's all these different species of creatures, and some of them are like good ones and pretty, and some of them are bad ones, and you can tell because of their like physiognomy, their face, the way their body is constructed, like all these ways signify their. Now, I think Tolkien is like, you know, ends up being like a much more complex example of this kind of genre. But Interestingly, like in Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, he explicitly actually like digs into the Jewiness of dwarves because he wrote like a satire of all these fantasy genres and tropes and things like that. So like for him, he was really also trying to like do some critical digging into the way that like trolls are uncomfortably close to certain racially scientific ways of thinking. I mean, race science is like not real science, right?
Yeah.
Ways of thinking about Black people and things like that. And dwarves are ways of thinking about Jews, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Already I'm sort of amazed at this discussion. All right.
We'll just wait for me and Cassia just to out nerd each other.
Yeah.
Oh, that's one of the banker goblins from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
We know those anti-Semitic caricatures.
We know them. Spell it out for us. Those less knowledgeable on the anti-Semitic.
This image is pretty.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's just a guy who likes coins.
Yes, with his lovely, again,
It's
sunken
so
eyes, big
disappointing.
nose.
And his like high sloping forehead and his large nose.
And he kind of like is
I love his
punching
long
too.
fingers.
Yeah. He's got to make sure he has them long enough to grab all that gold. And of course, he's in charge of the gold, and they're in charge of the money making system. And they're a subjugated species in the Harry Potter world. And there was a Goblin War that we don't really know a lot about, but was possibly about gaining freedom and like their own agency within this magical world. Where do they even exist outside of the banks? Like, do they just live underground? Sorry, I'm writing about this.
No, and it's totally not an accident at all that the pile of gold looks like a city, and it looks like the banker is actually controlling the city with his hands. It's not an accident.
Of course, and they look like they could be holding like little puppet. What are those things called?
Oh yeah,
marionettes.
Marionettes.
Yeah.
It's just so disappointing for me. Like, I have loved Harry Potter for as long as I can remember, right? And then when you see this like blatant image, it's of this depiction of a banker who's a goblin. It's just upsetting.
Well, apparently in the first movie, when he goes into the bank, if you pay attention to the floor, there's a Star of David on the ground just because of the filming location that they used.
But that must be a coincidence, huh?
Sure, but you could have edited that. Like, didn't they edit his eyes green in some of the films and stuff like that? Like, they had flying and mythical creatures, and you couldn't change a floor?
No, those cost a fortune to like wrangle those. It's all practical.
All right, point taken. Next. Who else do we have tonight on house arrest? I'd like to present this man.
Shrek.
He's Jewish.
Shrek is a Yiddish word. Actually, Shrek is a Yiddish word.
Yeah, he comes from wasn't it a Jewish writer who wrote the books to begin with?
Yeah, and it's not. Yeah, so Shrek is a Yiddish word. It means rage, actually. So he like used a word for anger for like this big old monster. But also, Shrek is the name of a Jewish punk band. Well, Jewish like avant-garde rock punk band led by one of my favorite musicians, Mark Rebo, from like kind of the new wave Jewish music scene in the 90s.
Wait. Shrek is Jewish? What does this mean? He's an ogre.
He's Jewish. He's Jewish.
Guys, yeah, please.
There are Jews in Scotland.
Yeah, there are Jews in Scotland. Come on. Also, I don't think he's really supposed to be Scottish, but it's like he's essentially a Jew. Like he's been taken. He's not part of the entire like white fairy tale community. He lives in his own little area, and he ends up helping the others who get brought out, and he only really wants to help them. Like that has nothing to do with Judaism, but I just love that he only wants to help them so he can get his place back. Like that's my favorite thing about him. He's like, get out of my house. And I'm like, I feel you, Shrek. I feel you a lot.
In that picture, it wouldn't be too hard to like if you put like a beard on him and stuff. He looks like he could be in Fiddler on the Roof.
And some payas. I see it now.
Yeah. I mean, like you could maybe like he like kind of exhibits certain aspects of like anti-Semitic characterization with the same sort of physicality as the previous ones. I think it's that when like I haven't read the Shrek books, but like Shrek in the series isn't actually a bad character. There isn't really anything about him where you're like, oh my god, he's horrible and he's like money grabbing or anything. He's a good guy. He's a mean guy, but he's a good guy.
well, not just that, but it's like it's flipping it, right? It's like it's saying, here's this again, like here's this species hierarchy. There's humans, which are good, and there's ogres, which are bad. And then it flips it because you see the prince or whatever, the royal ends up being like a real poopy guy, and Shrek ends up actually, because he has actually a really lovely, ultimately loving inside, ends up being, it's really about the there's actually a similar kind of book called The Goblin Emperor that came out somewhat recently. It's really lovely. It's a lovely little book, and but also it's really like it's like, okay, so like it's really invested in like, you know, like how much lineage of goblin you have, like, is going to determine you in the societal hierarchy. And it turns out that one of the emperors, after he dies, like one of his heirs ends up being part goblin. And it's like a big scandal that like a part goblin, like half goblin, matrilineally goblin. So I guess he's actually, according to even Orthodox goblins, he's a goblin. But he ends up like getting into the seat of power. And it really, like, it's a very sweet book, kind of all about court intrigue, but also the ways in which it's trying to resist or invert this kind of inherent racial or species-based or whatever, like hierarchies that we end up inheriting in fantasy genres.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to do. Like, that's the only way that you can really get away from them, is by kind of interrogating them in this way. I've seen attempts by authors to do this sort of thing, like Naomi Novik, who created AO3. We were talking about fan fiction earlier. She's one of the creators of it. She wrote Archive of Our Own. It's a website to post and read fan fiction. And it's free and it's great. But so she wrote Spinning Silver, which is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, and she puts Rumpelstiltskin as a Jewish character as like an attempt to kind of reclaim that. I found it to be not an excellent use of this attempt. But I've like read articles written by others about it, and like people react to it more positively than I did. But it is something that I've seen quite a few authors like do in more recent fantasy published works. Like I have a few books behind me that I'm planning on reading later. I don't have time right now, but it's like there's The Sisters in the Winter Wood, the one that I have, just came out with it, The World That We Knew. Both of those, well, one of them deals with golems and one of them deals with Jewish witches, essentially. So it's like they're both ways of bringing in like an interrogation of this characterization and othering, and making
that's so interesting to me, because I think that people would be surprised to learn about like the rich history Judaism has of, you know, fantastic creatures and you know, magicians and things like that, because it's not really relatable or applicable to Judaism as we know it today. So I want to talk about it. Josh must have gone off to find some like
I have many books like this right here. Look, we've got this one, which is on
Tree of Souls.
Oh, Howard Schwartz, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
I've got this one.
Oh, New Rochelle.
Yeah. I've got a few more, but now
there's the Wandering Stars. There's the Wandering Stars duopoly too. It's like Wandering Stars and more Wandering Stars, in which it tries to like mine Jewish fiction for like kind of at least inroads to speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. So my side of this more is I mean, I guess I'm just like a nerd on my own time, but my side of this is more on the research academic side. So there's a lot of actually really great work about recovering like Jewish occult or Jewish magical traditions, at least in terms of what it means to kind of do a revisionist history of Judaism. Part of that has to do, I think, with the ways in which Jews had to sell themselves as a community to the modern secular West, in like what it means for the Jews to, you know, like leave the ghetto and integrate into modern society. It had to do with like, look at our religion. Our religion's great. It's rational. It's really about, you know, like Talmud's about arguing and stuff like that. Isn't that cool? All this stuff about demons and magic, well, it was always marginal. So, you know, like people in what's called Wissenschaft des Judentums, right, the science of Judaism, who are repackaging a rational Judaism in the 19th century, inheriting like the Jewish enlightenment of the Haskalah in the 18th century. We're saying, look at like this guy Maimonides, right? Maimonides said not only are demons and magic a marginal phenomenon, it's actually, it's also like something that Judaism has always like opposed. It's never really been about that. The problem though, is that while, I mean, Maimonides is obviously the great eagle, he's one of the most important rabbis who ever lived, he was reading the story the way he wanted to see it, because he himself was a philosopher, like inheriting an Aristotelian tradition. He was a doctor, you know, every mother's favorite. He was a court doctor for the king in Egypt. But what we end up losing, though, is when we end up like crafting a Judaism up here, like a Judaism, we lose a lot of Jewish culture, right? We lose a lot of like folk culture, what it means to live as a Jew. One of my teachers actually in university once said, like, one of the only monotheists in Judaism was Maimonides. Like everyone else had demons, had ghosts, had like, you know, like had saints, you know, had like all these things that they also had as part of their enchanted life, right? And entering modernity is, you know, as Weber said, is about disenchanting life, right? Like, why does the rock fall? Oh, because of gravity, because of the laws of physics, da 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 da. Before, it's like, why does the rock fall? Well, actually, let me like dig into my spiritual life and try to figure out why the rock keeps on falling. And now,
it's funny now, like that makes so much sense to me. But now it's like the fact that we don't, so we promoted ourselves as, I guess, this rational, enlightened people. But now the fact that we don't take part, or some of us don't take part in this sort of more folk-like holiday, that's also othering us, right? Like we've sort of in no longer being the Jewish people who believe in demons and witches and things like that. Halloween is not our holiday anymore. So it's like, in an attempt to get closer to the community we're not a part of, we've sort of gotten farther from it now.
That's a really great point.
It is. And I think part of that is also like, even if it was only about spooks and stuff, then it would have been easier for us to come to it, possibly, instead of having like the Christian influence to it, because that's a lot harder for like reconciling, where you're like, oh yeah, you kind of stole this in a way from pagans, and then use it as a way to scare yourself about the other, and like dress up as the other, and then pretend to be them in a funny way. And that's great, but like not great for everyone who's the other.
Right. And not just like the other in a general sense, but so there's a work by a scholar who's funny. He like wrote this in like the early 20th century, but his work still has not been surpassed in terms of its like capacious nature, is Joshua Trachtenberg, who wrote two books. Which, like I figured Cassie has like Bucky in that. There we go. So here, as I mentioned them, they were great. So yeah, Devil and the Jews, and his masterwork, which again still hasn't been surpassed, Jews, Magic, and Superstition. In which, I mean, so I'll say Jews, Magic, and Superstition is an attempt to actually say, okay, look, Judaism has like an entire tradition of not just like mysticism, which also is like the kosher version, right? Mysticism, it's about God and speculation and like meditation, all the spiritual stuff.
Mysticism, like, it does have, I want to expand on this, because for my own interest, like I've always understood, you know, Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, it's like the only things I really knew about it was that you had to be like a 50-year-old man to be able to start learning it, right? And it talked about these sort of spirits that would sit around and do things, and it was so spooky that you had to be a certain someone to be able to like handle it. So that seems, when I was thinking about it tonight, like that seems quite Halloween-y to me.
Well, if anyone hasn't, I really want to encourage people to watch the 1920 version of the Dybbuk, which is.
I have a clip. We can.
Oh,
it's
so good. Are you playing it now?
Yeah, I can grab it. I don't know if it's the not.
I wanted to give a little color commentary. Can I do that while you're playing
it? You can try.
All right,
we'll see what happens.
I mean, unless she mutes you should be able to.
I mean, she probably will.
Uh-oh.
You deserve it.
All right, let's do it.
Rai Nadibu.
This is the right version, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's the only filmic version I'm aware of, at least. Okay. It was the last Yiddish movie produced actually in Europe. It was made in Poland, just as like the industry was, you know, sadly dying. And so actually this image too is actually pulled from the Dybbuk as well. It's an image of of a death dance or a death funeral.
Yeah,
The
that's
tightest
what this is going to be.
Yeah, yeah. There we go. Dance of death. Yeah. So it's a Titan dance, and it was used. They would actually have. I mean, actually, here's a bit of a COVID fact. Actually, it was often done in that they would hold a black wedding in the cemetery as a way of fighting against or using actually magic, ritual power to fight against an oncoming sickness or a plague.
What's a black wedding?
Yeah, here's a very evocative scene. I mean, what ends up causing the Dybbuk to happen? So, for a Dybbuk is when a spirit cleaves onto a living person and, in a sense, appropriates them. Right? It ends up like squatting in their body, and a Dybbuk literally means to cleave to. And interestingly, it's kind of like the dark version of Dveikut or Dveikus, which in Jewish mysticism is actually when the mystic cleaves to God. There's also, interestingly, and there's a lot of feminist, analysis you can do about this, also something called an ibur. An ibur is when actually a mystic will invoke a spirit of a rabbi that their soul is connected to actually bring that spirit of the rabbi into their body as well. And they'll do that often actually through prostrating themselves on the rabbi's graves. And ibur means pregnancy. Actually, so it's a male mystical fantasy of actually impregnation, or empreg, perhaps, as Cassia might say, in which they're bringing in actually another life, another spirit into their body, another self even into their body. Now that, interestingly, so the Dybbuk displaces you, but then ibur actually is a cooperative partnership. You end up like being roommates in your body versus having someone evict you.
Yeah, very like, fantastic.
That's like, what is it? The black thing that infects Spider-Man.
Oh, Venom. The symbiote.
Yeah.
The symbiote.
Yeah. Doesn't he end up in like a kind of friendly relationship with the Tom Hardy guy?
Oh, yeah. No, Eddie Brock and the Venom symbiote end up becoming, actually, the recent writing of the Venom comic by Donny Cates is like explores actually this really beautiful kind of like pet-like relationship, like pet and owner, but the way in which often like the pet can take control of the owner relationship. It's really, really, it's cute. It's very
That's
sweet.
pretty cool. Yeah, because I remember when I'd seen that in the comics of it, but like I didn't read a lot of the comics. And then when the movie came out, it was all over the internet how that was like very much a not taking over relationship. It's more symbiotic, which makes sense for it to be called a symbiote.
Exactly.
Well, would you two say that in general it's complicated because it's two-sided, right? Judaism has its own history of sort of the fantastic, but it tends to be that the fantasy genre, Josh, as you were saying, is so wrapped up in this race science, right? Certain peoples or certain creatures look certain ways. What's that?
And Christianity.
And Christianity, yeah.
Right. Yeah, like
I'm just wondering, like, overall, like, would you say that in I don't know, secular thought that there are like more negative connotations regarding magic and wizardry, therefore like this negative attribution to these Jewish mystical figures?
Well, I know, like, if you read The Devil or the Jews anyway, or just anything about medieval attitude toward Jews, like a part of it, which I can see is, I don't really know if this is when Jews decided to kind of have more logic and rationalism post medieval times, but during that time, it was very much like Jews, all magic is Jewish magic and all magic is bad. And so therefore all Jewish magic is bad because they didn't understand what Jews do and they didn't understand our prayers. They didn't understand all that. We speak a completely different language. We wear funny clothes, sometimes wear funny hats, like all of that. Like it was very much a conception that Jews hold the magic and like Jewish men can menstruate and they smell like sulfur because they're best friends with the devil or they control the devil, like all of that. There's this whole thing about Jews have the magic. So I can see that as part of the reason why we would have like separated from our own mysticism, because it's like when you're being subjugated for being thought of as this way, you might be like, okay, well actually like we're not really only that, and maybe we can be safe if we say that we're not.
Yeah, and that's a really actually really elegant way of putting it. I mean, we also, though, I mean, to be fair, so like there is this, culture, right? The Christian-centric culture, the Christian hegemonic culture, right? Which assigns the Jews the role not just of other, but actually of like identical with the devil, keeping salvation from coming, right? The classic image of Augustine, right? That the Jews would be left as a witness to show actually like, oh, look, we were wrong, we were wrong. The correctness of Christianity is proven on the Jew, right? That's like what's written on our bodies. But, you know, what I kind of was thinking about this is that we're identified in this, you know, in this, as you were quite right in saying, with the object of horde, since we're putatively like aligned with the other side, the evil side, the force that keeps people from salvation. But in a way, like to have a Jewish Halloween, the goal in its ways is to move from object to subject, in which we actually recover what we are afraid of, or language in that regard, or resources to craft the culture of our own. The problem, though, in some ways, though, is that, I mean, interestingly, brought up the Jew-witch connection before, is that, you know, that too, actually, funny enough, is actually something happening in the wider world, right? It's happening in like millennial and Zoomer culture in general, is trying to like
but
the horoscope.
A lot of them are appropriating that from other cultures. Like they'll appropriate from Native American, they'll appropriate from Black American, they'll appropriate from Kabbalah. Like, oh my God.
Right.
So
I wanted to actually say something about that, is that like, when we talk about the supernatural or the transcendent, it is something that theoretically is beyond human beings, beyond human culture, beyond human civilizations, and thus beyond politics. So there's a lot of discourse right now about sensitivity, about appropriating various cultures and religious cultures and things like that. And I think on a political level, I completely understand that. I'm very sensitive to and agree with it. But interestingly, it's actually making a claim in a way that's racist, namely that metaphysics also sees race. That metaphysics has cultural boundaries too, and that to cross the streams is actually not allowed. And interestingly, we end up in a way rehearsing a kind of metaphysics, a spiritual metaphysics that is ethnocentric, that we see in actually we see in certain versions of Kabbalah that sees a metaphysical difference between a Jewish soul and a non-Jewish soul, or something like that. And the logic of let's say cultural appropriation when it comes to the transcendent is also saying, okay, no, there's Jewish magic and there's not Jewish magic. There's Irish magic and Swedish magic or whatever, and you have a right to it if you have certain genetics. So it's like a 23andMe for magic.
I don't really think so. I see what you're saying, but I think that the reason why it's spoken about so much about like don't appropriate is because you don't know what it is. Like I see a lot, I'm not in these communities, but I follow people that are in them, and I see a lot of them having discussions about Lilith. And it's like the people that are utilizing Lilith in their practice don't really understand Lilith as this character in Judaism, and Lilith as like what all of the mythology says about her. And it's just like, well, she's cool, and like she denied Adam and all of that. And it's just like, it's not, I don't see it so much as saying like there's a difference between our mysticisms. It's like you're just not understanding the fully like entire thing about it, because you're just coming at it and taking pieces that you want and then being like, this is what's good for me. And it's like, okay, but like do some more research on it, learn more about it, and then you can also do it, but like with respect.
I think interestingly, you actually end up in a way like reframing the thing that Adina said before about Kabbalah, right? That it's done only by like 40-year-old men, right? And like we look at that, we taught about that nowadays, and you know, that's not my politics either. But I think the point of it being, of mysticism always being esoteric, it's always being secret, and by that what we mean is protected, because it is access to a precious and often dangerous truth. And because of that, to have access to it, you need to be trained. You need to go through the rigors. You need to be inducted into a tradition, which means a real relationship with real teachers. Interestingly, in the Talmud, there's a really interesting parallel, if I can just mention it really quickly. In the Masechet Sanhedrin, which is usually about like courts and judges, and boring stuff like that, there's a really interesting passage on page 67, in which Abaye says, one of the rabbis in the Amoraic period, says, one who is particular about his craft, his amana, which means like omanut, right, his like artisanship, is invoking demons. But one who is not particular about his craft is using sorcery. So that's interesting, right? Because Sorcery, I mean, and here's where Judaism is a little complicated, right? Because in the Torah, it says, don't suffer, do not tolerate a witch, right? Don't suffer a witch to live. So we have this internal language of kishuf, machshefa, things like that, which are seen as not allowed. But as a lot of anthropologists talk about, magic is the language that people use for the religion you don't want to let in, right? Religion good, magic bad. But if you zoom out, it's really, in a sense, like, what club are you in? What thing are you talking about? So the person who's invoking demons is somebody who's been, in a way, inducted into the tradition. But somebody who's just like slapdashing around, somebody who's just like dabbling, in the way Cassia is talking about, that's sorcery. And that's actually, interestingly, not allowed. And I think kind of the protection thing is that, yeah, if you're particular about it, it means that you have been taught. You have been brought into a relationship. You have been brought into a community in which you have been trained, right? You've had to watch the video. You know what's going on. Versus you're just, in a sense, dabbling and you're just consuming it versus what it means to be a steward of it. Interesting. This is the same passage in which it says that rabbis would occupy themselves with a book of creation, create a 3-year-old calf before Shabbat, slaughter it, and eat it.
Yeah. The wonders of the Talmud. Lastly, before we just say goodnight, I'll ask both of you, just in your opinions, considering your research, your own opinions, and what we spoke about tonight. What do you think we can learn from the wizards, the witches, the demons, the fairies, the sort of Kabbalistic figures? What value can they add to our understanding of Jewish today?
I think kind of that not everything is what it looks like when it's in front of you. And like the way that you maybe grew up thinking of Judaism, or thinking of your approach to your Judaism, or thinking of your approach to yourself, or thinking of your approach to the world, and what you're seeing, that's not the whole of it. And that's kind of what you see when you read fantasy and read about witches and wizards and fairies. It's like all of this there's more than just what's in your eyesight. And I think that's something that you can take with you and grow from.
You have to unmask it, if you will.
Yeah.
For the pity laugh, Josh.
No, good job. I mean, as somebody who has a deep interest in mysticism, I think Cassia just said it way better than I ever could in terms of that. So that's a really great way of putting it. I want to bring up another Yiddish movie as my closing thought. It's a movie called Gutman and Teufel, God, Man, and Devil. And it's actually an anti-capitalist movie in which a pious Jew ends up getting seduced into owning a factory, and he ends up just like sacrificing all his values to make a profit. And the factory is a tallis factory. He's making ritual prayer shawls. And the end of the movie, spoiler alert, if you want to watch the movie, turn it off now. At the end of the movie, his right-hand man brings home a bloody small figure wrapped in a tallis. And the figure ends up being his son, who was working in the factory, who had gotten mangled by the machine and killed. And realizing it's a Faustian story, realizing that the deal he had struck with the devil, which really in this case though was commercialism and money, right? The deal he had struck into taking away the thing he loved most in the world, his son. And what he ends up doing, and you see this only in the shadows, but he ends up hanging himself with the tallis. And I gasped when I saw that movie, not only because it's an incredibly powerful film and it's really, really good and worth seeing, but also because it was the image of tragedy and of horror was taken from a particularly Jewish grammar. It was a Jewish symbol that was being used. The tallis factory and the use of the tallis was used to poetically end the story and end his life. What I loved about that was it really, I think, was like a call to arms for what it could be like for us to resist the ways in which Christian culture, Christian themes, and the ways in which it's appropriated and incorporated paganism, thing like that, define fantasy, define the horror genre, and actually dig into our own culture, dig into our own folk traditions, dig into our own demonologies and angelologies and magical stories and magical incantation bowls and all these things that do exist in Jewish history, and be able to craft a particularly Jewish approach to these things. Not so we have to throw away science and be like, oh, actually now I'm all about elves, but rather say, here is a way for me to actually create a beautiful and pleasurable aesthetics that's drawn from Jewish images, Jewish symbols, and Jewish culture. And I think that in terms of Jews and Halloween, we can really maybe challenge ourselves to stop just being the things that people are scared of and start actually learning how to scare people ourselves.
Ooh, goosebumps. That's really great. Wow, I honestly didn't know how tonight would go because I knew it wasn't my realm of expertise at all, and I'm just blown away by this conversation. We've gone over time, and I feel like we could keep talking for hours on this. So thank you to the both of you for your insight and your intellect, and just it's really fascinating. And I'm wondering, just as a sign off, do we say Happy Halloween? What do you think?
I mean, it is the season.
Freilichen Halloween.
Freilichen Halloween. Tomorrow night, I'll be hosting our Thursday night event. It's called BYOI, Bring Your Own Ideas. So we want all of you to come with whatever's on your mind for an open space just to chat and have real conversations with fellow Jewish young professionals. So I look forward to seeing all of our viewers there. And again, thanks so much for tonight, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.